I'm Andrew Falzone. From simple motor function to complex thinking and analysis, our brain plays the most crucial role in our ability to process information. Curious about how all that works? Science and You starts right now.
I'm Dr. Max Gomez. Do you know what part of your brain controls emotions, coordinates movement, registers sensation? I'll tell you all of that and more coming up on Science and You.
I'm Donna Hanover. Many people took the Ice Bucket Challenge to help battle ALS. Researchers are working intensively to find out how this brain disease works and how to fight it. That's ahead on Science and You.
I'm Andrew Falzone. Dementia is a disease that goes well beyond memory loss, and doctors here at Weill Cornell believe they've developed new software that can predict when and where new symptoms will occur. That story's coming up on Science and You.
I'm Mike Gilliam for Science and You. Did you know your brain can make decisions while you're sleeping? It's possible. We're going to visit a sleep center and look at a groundbreaking study ahead on Science and You.
Is it possible to gain an understanding of how the brain is developed? We'll have that answer coming up on Science and You.
I'm Dr. Max Gomez. It's by far the most complex organ in the human body. It controls movement, feeling, sensation, emotions, personality, who we are. The human brain. We don't know everything about it, but over the years, researchers have figured out and mapped areas of the brain where certain functions live in the brain. Here's what we know. It's not a particularly impressive looking organ, considering its importance. It's kind of squishy with numerous blood vessels and covered in membranes called meninges. But its function was a mystery for millennia. Aristotle surmised that mental activity occurred there, but it wasn't for another 1,000 years that philosophers began to ascribe certain functions to specific brain areas. Crude and almost entirely incorrect. Then in the mid-1800s, an American railroad worker named Phineas Gage survived a construction accident in which an iron tamping rod was blown completely through his skull, destroying much of the part of his brain known as the left frontal lobe.
And it was noted then that he had a change in his personality. So frontal lobe and personality became associated with each other.
Neurosurgeon Dr. David Chaliff explains that deficits observed after trauma like Gage's, or due to tumors, strokes, and other diseases, allowed scientists to start to figure out what functions reside in which parts of the brain. Let's start with the frontal lobes, the area that was injured in Phineas Gage.
There are two frontal lobes. They're identical to each other. And the most important function in the frontal lobe is personality, affect, executive function, drive, who you are as a person.
To be clear, there's a lot of overlap in functional brain areas, but the gross functions have been clearly mapped over the past century or so. The lobes behind the frontal lobes are called the parietal lobes.
The parietal lobe has a variety of sophisticated functions, but the two gross functions that it subserves are movement and sensation. So if someone has a stroke, a bleed, a tumor in their parietal lobe, they will have a paralysis or weakness on the opposite side of the body.
Those parts of the parietal lobe are called the motor strip, where movement originates, and behind it the sensory strip, where we register sensation. But not all parts of the body are equally represented. Body parts with lots of nerve endings, like fingers and lips, take up much more brain space. A physical representation of that is called a homunculus, literally a little man that is deformed to show the heavily innervated areas. Since that electrical mapping in the mid-20th century, more advanced brain scanning has confirmed and refined other functional areas, like the complex structures in the temporal lobe of the brain.
The temporal lobe is involved with hearing, the temporal auditory pathways. The temporal lobe is involved with memory. And the temporal lobe is also involved with speech. So the temporal lobe is a very complicated structure. The hippocampus is the part of the temporal lobe that's about as far from the surface as you can get. It's near the brainstem, and injuries in this area can lead to memory defects.
And finally, there are the occipital lobes at the back of the brain. That's where vision is registered. And the cerebellum, which sort of hangs off the rear of the brain. That's the balance and coordination center of the brain.
It's not just moving your limbs. There's a coordination involved. Sitting erect without wobbling. So that's what the cerebellum does. The cerebellum, in a basic sense, is the balance center of the brain.
So as much as we know about where certain functions live in the human brain, we're a long way from understanding how it comes up with emotions, creativity, artistry, empathy. It's still a pretty amazing 3-pound organ. For Science and You, I'm Dr. Max Gomez.
I'm Donna Hanover. If you took the Ice Bucket Challenge to fight ALS, you were helping to raise awareness of a disease where the brain can no longer tell the muscles to move. Scientists here at the Gesso Lab at Columbia University and around the country are working to find a cure.
Millions of people dumped ice water over themselves recently to call attention to ALS, a myotrophic lateral sclerosis.
And this will help find a cure. I'm not going to argue with science.
The first symptoms of ALS are often small, trouble turning the car key in the ignition or a slight slurring of words. But soon people lose the ability to walk, talk, swallow, and breathe. One such person was Jennifer Estes.
My sister Jennifer was diagnosed with ALS when she was 35 years old. She was living and working in the city as a theater producer. Her initial symptom was weakness in her legs. And she just wrote it off to, New York City woman working after midnight, working herself too hard. But eventually she saw a neurologist. Her doctors told her to max out her credit cards and to go see Europe if she hadn't already, because she was going to die certainly from ALS.
No treatment.
No treatments available.
Jennifer and her sisters, Valerie and Meredith, founded Project ALS to drive research. Scientists know that in ALS, motor neurons in the spine lose the slender axon extensions that conduct electrical impulses that cause muscles to contract, and motor neurons in the brain are involved as well. Preeminent neuroscientist Tom Jessel led research in mice that had stunning results.
We spent a long time studying the problem, a simple problem, ostensibly, of how motor neurons become motor neurons during the development of an organism. And remarkably, a postdoctoral fellow, now a faculty member at Columbia, Hinek Vishtali, found that simply applying 2 small molecule chemicals to embryonic stem cells converted half of those cells into motor neurons.
Building on all this research, the Project ALS lab was hailed by Time magazine in 2008 for Scientific Breakthrough of the Year when its scientists turned skin cells from ALS patients into stem cells and then into motor neuron cells. Some people call them ALS in a dish. Various cancer, epilepsy, and diabetes drugs are currently being tested on such cells to find something that will stop the death of the motor neurons. Researcher Ayman Azim explains the importance of cells that are now motor neurons that have actually come from patients.
Instead of crossing our fingers and hoping that we have an accurate model of the disease, we have the disease. We have that patient's cell with their mutation.
It must be great for people that have ALS to be able to say, okay, use my skin cell, and maybe that will help in the research.
Absolutely, and we can study it. And that, if one day we're able to make the cells that are relevant to replace their dying neurons, is it going to be a really promising avenue, because this is already a cell from that person, so we don't have to worry about an immune rejection of this transplanted cell the same way you would have to worry about it if we were transplanting from another animal or from another human.
So this is a huge development.
It's a huge development, yeah.
Long-term, doctors are hoping to someday inject healthy stem cells that will become good motor neurons. Mice with ALS-like symptoms have recovered some ability to walk with that approach. Another avenue of research is that most ALS patients never lose the ability to control their eyes.
One of the studies we've been doing recently focuses on the eyes and eye movements and why the eyes aren't affected in ALS. So what's different about the brain cells that control the eyes?
So what Tim is working on here is he's able to watch motor neuron activity in living spinal cord and see why does a disease target certain types of motor neurons that are responsible for moving your limbs or breathing, but not other types of motor neurons that control eye movements.
Researchers at Columbia, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and other institutions are collaborating on many other urgent questions. They're studying new evidence that sometimes brain cells called astrocytes may be toxic to motor neurons, and that inflammation may be involved in the death of motor neurons. There are also tests on immune system cells in the brain called microglia that appear to go rogue, harming the neurons they're supposed to protect. And sometimes there is an obvious genetic cause to ALS, so gene silencing trials are being planned as well.
One of the more promising avenues in research is the identification of a few very specific genes that when they're mutated, we know they cause what's called familial ALS. It's where multiple members of a family all have the same mutation. We know the genes we want to go after, and I think there's a lot of hope that in the next 5-10 years we'll be able to get greater access and fix the malfunction in the neurons that we care about.
ALS is often called Lou Gehrig's disease after the Yankee baseball great who lost his career and his life to the disease. Jennifer Estes died in 2003. In the years since then, significant progress has been made on the road to finding a treatment. The disease in a dish concept may help solve other brain mysteries as well.
There's no doubt that what we learn about ALS will inform our efforts to understand Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's. The fact that you can now model certain brain diseases in a dish will clearly give scientists all over the place ideas about why diseases happen and how we might slow them down or even stop them.
So the brain is opening up its secrets to determined groups of researchers. For those with ALS and other diseases that seemed intractable just a few years ago, there's now reason to anticipate a cure. I'm Donna Hanover for Science and You.
I'm Andrew Falzone. Dementia is a disease with symptoms that go far beyond memory loss, and managing those symptoms can be a challenge for caregivers. New software developed here at Weill Cornell Medical Center may help predict when and where those symptoms may occur.
I think of it as a weather radar map of the atrophy on your brain. This is today, and we see it spread as if it was a Doppler radar map. Everyone's seen that on TV.
Dr. Ashish Raj may not have much in the way of formal medical training, but he was able to put his PhD in computer science and his background in electrical engineering to good use, helping to unravel one of the most mysterious diseases that destroys the most complex computer on the face of the earth, the human brain.
We know exactly what is connected to what in the brain, and we call that concept a graph or a network. Which can be easily represented by the fact that you have a region here, it's connected to this region here. By knowing how strong that connection is, you can obtain a graph. And all we have to do mathematically is to figure out how, when the disease starts in one node of the graph, it spreads to the rest of the graph.
The diseases that Dr. Raj and his team focused on are collectively known as dementias, which cause parts of the brain to die slowly over the course of time, essentially causing brain failure. While different types of dementia have their own underlying causes, all are neurodegenerative, which means they cause brain cells known as neurons to die one by one. Perhaps the most well-known form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, but Dr. Raj's research has shown his new software applies to more than just Alzheimer's.
So this will be applicable to all dementias. It will be applicable to Parkinson's, ALS, Huntington's, frontotemporal dementia, corticobasal syndrome. However, I want to be careful and point out that we've actually only tested this on three diseases we've talked about: Alzheimer's, frontotemporal, and Parkinson's.
Dr. Raj's software does not require anything beyond a typical MRI that would be ordered by a neurologist or psychiatrist at the suspected onset of dementia. Once a dementia diagnosis is confirmed, the software is able to analyze the MRI image and predict the spread of shrinkage or atrophy in the brain. As different parts of the brain slowly wither away, different symptoms can emerge in patients.
We think we can do this with a yearly resolution. Anything less than that is probably unrealistic because these are relatively slow processes. It could take up to 20 years for Alzheimer's pathology to ramify within the brain.
Personally, my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and I know that it was very hard on my grandfather and also hard on my mother in trying to manage her care.
Dr. Amy Kuszewski is an associate professor of mathematics and radiology at Cornell Weill who helped work on the software. Better known symptoms of dementia include memory loss and eventual loss of mobility and continence, but some lesser-known mid-stage symptoms can include delusions, hallucinations, and behavioral outbursts. By predicting the onset, caregivers may be better able to plan for the legal, financial, and medical needs created by the disease. While dealing with dementia symptoms can be complicated, Dr. Raj came up with an astoundingly simple solution to model exactly how dementia progressed through the brain. Using a centuries-old model of gas diffusion and turning it into a computer algorithm, Dr. Raj was able to show that dementia spreads through the brain much in the same way that molecules move through the air.
Then it occurred to me that any simple model of spread would be okay at predicting this progression. And the simplest one I could think of, as I've said, is diffusion. Just put the two together and it seems to work.
In an upcoming study to be published in the medical journal Cell Reports, Dr. Raj's software was able to demonstrate its accuracy. The software was used to analyze ongoing MRI images of Alzheimer's patients from a government-funded research database. The computer models were compared to the actual patient progression on MRI, and the software was able to produce accurate results. Though Dr. Raj's software isn't clinically available yet, he says he expects trials to begin here at Weill Cornell in the next year. I'm Andrew Falzone for Science and You.
I'm Mike Gilliam for Science and You. A recent study has researchers re-examining what goes on in our brains while we're sleeping. It says we can actually make decisions while we sleep. To learn more about it, we've come to the Columbia University Sleep Center. Sleep. We all do it. But our notion of what's going on when we're asleep is rapidly changing. Dr. Andrew Westwood is a sleep expert who conducts sleep studies at New York Presbyterian Columbia University Medical Center. He's read the study published in Current Biology and written about in the Washington Post by authors Thomas Adrian and Sid Coeder. That says that they have shown that complex stimuli can not only be processed while we sleep, but that this information can be used to make decisions just like we do when we're awake.
Sleep used to be felt as a passive process where everything shuts down and then you reboot in the morning. But actually there's more and more evidence coming to light that things are actually actively going on during your sleep. You're forming new memories, and there's some evidence that you're learning some new things in light parts of sleep.
The researchers studied two groups of people, both while they were awake and while sleeping.
What they did was they looked at words that people were familiar with initially when they were awake to see if they were animals or objects, and then they looked at words during sleep to see if they were real words or if they were not real words, if they were made-up words.
And people could distinguish between the two in their sleep?
So based on this data, they suggested that people were responding correctly during light stages of sleep.
The authors wrote that when they measured their subjects' brain activity while saying words to them, they could tell whether or not the subject was categorizing the words and making a decision about which category the word fell into. What does that mean to a guy like you, to researchers and people who deal with sleep?
Yeah, so sleep is really a big mystery. It really is. It's not clear that we understand it fully yet. It suggests that we need to do more research in this area, potentially looking at different stages of sleep. For example, there's several different stages of sleep, and one of those is the rapid eye movement sleep, where your eyes dart back and forth, and that's when we know people generally have sort of colourful dreams. It would be interesting to see if there was any activity going on during there, and you could learn and respond to the environment during that particular stage of sleep.
But making decisions while we sleep? Does that mean if I have a big work decision tomorrow and I spend a lot of time thinking about it before I go to sleep, my brain will be able to make the decision while I'm asleep?
Decision making really needs to be done during wakefulness, and you shouldn't be making all your decisions or hoping they're going to be made in your sleep.
Okay, so it's not a breakthrough in that respect yet. Westwood says to even try to set the brain up by thinking about a problem right up until you go to sleep is a bad thing and can lead to insomnia and poor performance the following day. And there are also health implications that go with a lack of sleep, because there's evidence the brain is working while we sleep.
In terms of memory, for example, there have been research that suggests that slow wave sleep is important for different types of memory, and that REM sleep, the dreaming sleep, is used for other sorts of memory. We know that people have better recollection after they've taken a nap or they've been sleeping after they've learned something new. We know that the immune system changes during sleep, and that people feel more sleepy when they're ill, and they get better if they're able to sleep and rest more. So it's likely that sleep's good for a restorative process and part of the immune system as well. We also know that people generally grow in their sleep.
There's also evidence that the brain sheds toxins while we sleep. But getting back to the study and making decisions in your sleep.
I think it's an important study. You know, it's showing us some new evidence, but I think we need to take home that we're not going to be able to make decisions in our sleep based on this study. We may need to consider reevaluating what sleep actually is and what stages of sleep are doing. But it definitely needs more investigation into the active process of sleep.
Even the study's authors agree, saying, "We proved here that sleep is not an all or none state. Not that forcing our brain to learn to do things during the night would be ultimately beneficial in the long run." So, more research is needed, but we already know that the brain is much more active when we're sleeping than we originally thought. I'm Mike Gilliam for Science and You.
For a more in-depth explanation of how the brain is developed, we recently visited the New York Academy of Sciences, which hosted a conference on this very topic with a lot of experts from across the country to help us better understand our brain. Melanie Brickman-Steins is the director of Life Science Conferences for the New York Academy of Science.
This conference was divided into two different parts. The first part was a public lecture, which was quite exciting. It was entitled Baby Talk, Closing the Achievement Gap Word by Word. And it centered on the word gap, which is the 30 million fewer words that children from lower socioeconomic homes hear than their higher socioeconomic counterparts before they reach the age of 3. And this often leads to them having to catch up in school and throughout life. So this conference focused on ways to really improve upon that for them and develop interventions.
Associate Professor Dr. Catherine Monk of the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University Medical Center discussed an important connection between hearing and the brain.
Kids as young as 7 months, when you're talking to them, not only is the auditory area of the brain getting activated, which you would expect, it's wiring up to learn the differences of their native speech, but the motor cortex. And that's so fascinating because it suggests that there's some practicing going on for speaking in the process of hearing. When you are interacting with a 7-month-old, you're not expecting them to talk to you. And yet it seems that their brain is already getting ready. It's soaking up the sound in the auditory cortex, and it's doing some firing in the motor to get ready for conversation. So way before we can see it in terms of our behavioral interaction.
So if they're hearing fewer words, this communication process, it isn't really going, this communication process isn't happening properly in their brains. And when you extrapolate it out over time, research has shown that those children who hear fewer words, it leads to delays in their language, and once they get to school, they're behind their counterparts. And the delays kind of continue on throughout time.
But research shows brain development begins way before infancy.
We have 80 to 90 billion neurons in our brains, and the lion's share of those are developed in utero. And in terms of where those neurons are going to rest, to be sure they're on the right layer of the brain and that it has the right architecture, the lion's share of that happens by 29 weeks in pregnancy. And in the 34th week of pregnancy, all those synaptic connections, which is part of the connections in our brain that allow us to do all that we do, at the 34th week of pregnancy, the estimation is that every second, 40,000 synapses are being created. So this is just a phenomenal time of brain development.
To better understand how the brain develops, a simple analogy may be used.
Alan Srofe, who's an emeritus psychologist from the University of Minnesota, described development as branches on a tree. And if you really think about a tree, some branches, curve a bit and then they straighten out towards the sun. Some have gotten, blown by the weather and maybe they're still not doing so well and they actually are truncated. That development is very, we use the word plastic. It's malleable, it can be moved, it interacts with the environment. But certainly movement in the future is constrained by the past.
Researchers have begun to correlate such things as a mother's stress during pregnancy with possible causes of certain disorders or illnesses.
One of the mechanisms potentially is the level of cortisol, of a stress hormone that the fetus is exposed to in utero. It seems that women who are very anxious in pregnancy have less of activation. We know this through seeing what genes are turned on or turned off, of a specific gene in the placenta that protects the fetus from high levels of this cortisol crossing over. So the factor is distress in pregnancy. And when there are high levels of it, it's associated with a risk for having attention deficit and other behavioral problems in 6- and 7-year-olds.
A good diet, rest, and lack of stress are the key to a successful pregnancy. But one aspect to a pregnant woman's well-being may not be so obvious.
So there's emerging to be some association that if you have just even mild gingivitis or dental illness, the bacteria can travel through the blood and have an impact on the placenta. An immune response is mounted, and an inflammatory system and some of those immune markers can have an effect on the developing brain or lead to preterm birth.
Once the baby is born, Dr. Monk says it is crucial that he or she get a lot of human interaction to help stimulate the brain, and a parent should not be tempted to expose a child to technology.
The American Academy of Pediatrics has really come out against screens. They're hugely fascinating to even very, very young children, and certainly they're part of our society, but they don't need to be in young toddlers' lives at all, and that's time away from interaction.
Communication is key to good brain development, which begins in the womb. So after that healthy pregnancy, even if the baby doesn't answer you, it doesn't mean they don't understand. From the New York Academy of Sciences, I'm Magali Laguerre-Wilkinson for Science and You.
That's our show for today. Thanks for watching. I'm Andrew Falzone. We'll see you next time on Science and You.